Aloha, Surfing for Truth here, and we want to talk about a Civil Beat and Hawaii News Now poll that came out asking people who they choose in the GOP gubernatorial primary in Hawaii next month. What we want to cover in this video is some of the trickiness with polls and how they can easily be crafted to paint a certain picture, which begs the question, is their purpose really a temperature check of where things are, or is it psychological manipulation? Who is really in the lead in this race? As was even admitted by the outlets, the sample size for this poll is extremely small, 269 self-reported Republican primary voters. While they declared Duke Aiona the clear winner, they admit in the same breath that he is really tied with BJ Penn given a 6 plus or minus percentage point margin of error of their results. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. What that means essentially is that within the realm of this poll, the true result could be Duke Aiona at 21% and BJ Penn at 30%, or Heidi Tsuneyoshi at 30% and Gary Cordry at 13%. Our graphic here reflects the admitted margin of error. In a TV segment about this poll, Civil Beat and Hawaii News Now admitted and joked in their commentary how unexpected it is that Duke Aiona would be positioned where he is in the poll, having dropped in literally on the last day and without much campaigning. Right, you go ahead and call it unexpected. We decided to take a closer look at this poll. It gets interesting just looking at who is behind the poll. The Civil Beat article about this poll links to a PDF with results produced by the public research org MRG Research, who conducted the poll. The PDF links to MRG Research's Twitter account, and their Twitter profile links to a website. This is the website you land on, and I quote from the About section. More recently, we've branched into the public election space, handling the state of Hawaii's Democratic presidential primary for the 2020 White House contest. Isn't that interesting? We are one of the first and only firms that can facilitate ranked choice voting, and we'll have to keep our thoughts about ranked choice voting for another time. Isn't it interesting that the same players control elections and polls? It makes sense from their perspective, as they need the polls and final election results to somewhat align to maintain any credibility. So if you know that our elections are rigged, what do you think happens with polling? Remember in 2016 when all the polls were handing it to Hillary Clinton? While we're certain there was cheating going on at the time as well, they were not prepared for the massive turnout for Trump, and so the fakery of the polls was exposed. Looking more closely at how the poll was conducted gives us a sense of how it can be manipulated. Let's start with a margin of error, and here's how it's explained. Results were weighted based on likelihood of voting, and were balanced for gender, age, ancestry, ethnicity, race, county and congressional district of residence, education meaning college degree attainment, and survey platform text to online versus landline to match the demographic parameters of registered voters statewide. There is no further data or detail to explain how this was done. What data are the parameters based on? Voter rolls now or in the last election cycle? There was reportedly an increase in voter registration and turnout in the last election since we started with mail-in ballots. Is that being considered, and the demographics of that? Basically, we want to know, is the 6 plus or minus margin of error fair? Further, weighting was done to match parameters of registered voters. New, first-time, and young voters need to be a big consideration in this upcoming election. So it's interesting that we just don't know who participated in this poll. The data provided gives a breakdown of the percentage of respondents that were either male versus female in different age groups by ethnicity, college attendance, and their politics. So the demographics that were mentioned earlier that they weighted and balanced for. What they don't provide is the number of respondents in each category. And we'll take a look at why that's a bit problematic. So we know, for example, that 26% of all males gave the answer not sure versus 28% of all females that responded. We have no idea out of the 269 polled if it was 200 males and 69 females, and if their weighting brings you closer to a 50-50 type of balance according to their undisclosed weighting methodology. We could be looking at pretty skewed information. Who responded and how their response was weighted will impact the result. Also, wouldn't self-identified Republicans be mostly all conservative? The detail about respondents' politics would be very telling about the poll results as a whole. And there's more we simply don't know. The poll report states that polling was conducted via landline with interactive voice response or cell phone text linked to an online survey, and using random probability-based sampling of registered voters in Hawaii. They tell us how responses were conducted for the overall poll, but what they don't provide is the ratio of polling via landline versus mobile for the subsample of just the self-identified Republican voters. Supposedly, this too was weighted to reflect relevant results, but how? that is not exactly straightforward to assume how it was done. So approximately 2/3 of the total sample, not just the Republicans, completed the poll via text to online, and then the other 1/3 completed it via calls to landline phones. With a subset of Republican voters being 24%, or about 1/4, of the total polling sample, they could have all been done via landline only. We don't know, and that definitely could impact the results significantly. Why it matters. All frontrunners besides Duke Aiona were favored, percentage-wise, by younger voters polled. So with what we looked at before, it becomes clear how the number of respondents by age group would certainly impact overall results of the poll. It's probably safe to assume, too, that older voters would have landlines versus their younger counterparts. So again, this detail of how data was obtained matters. So taking all these numbers with a grain of salt, there are some interesting takeaways. Thinking ahead of the general election, a winning candidate must appeal to liberal, progressive, and moderate-leaning voters. Duke Aiona and BJ PENN, according to this poll, appeal across the board. But we do see the largest percentage of moderate voters for BJ PENN. And our perspective is that we would expect to see more moderate and non-engaged voters taking part in this election. Heidi Tsuneyoshi scored big with liberal, progressive-leaning voters polled. Interesting that those were, again, we don't know how many of them, but very low on the conservative side. So is she considered more liberal and progressive? We did reach out to Civil Beat and the research company to ask for their actual data and or answers to our questions about the unknown details we discussed here. Civil Beat was only able to answer one question, which was related to clarifying information that was already in the report, but said they did not have details on any additional information. If we saw the data, we could determine ourselves whether the results presented are meaningful and fair. Why wouldn't they share them if it was all on the up and up?